Backyard Farmer Presents Lifestyle Gardening is a production of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension.
Good morning and welcome to Lifestyle Gardening. I'm Kim Todd and we've got another half hour of good gardening for you. This morning we'll be demonstrating how to plant bulbs and we'll focus on public containers. Later on we'll show you some beautiful ornamental grasses, but first we're going to feature using prairie plants in your home landscape. We took our cameras to Union Square here in Lincoln to show you what's possible. It's really wonderful to see the resurgence of interest in using native and adapted plant materials and a style that is really plains style or Nebraska style, whatever you want to call it, whether it's in a public landscape or in a private landscape. We have a lot of communities around the state and in the region where people in their own home landscapes are also looking at how can they actually get a little bit more character, attract those pollinators, use some of our native and adapted materials. It's not difficult, it's also not easy, and this is a great season to be able to go out and look at what works in the landscape, whether it's a public setting such as this, or a private home, or even the nurseries to see what is available. Look at the color combinations, look at the textures and the forms, pick out what you like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how you actually put those plants together. Whether it's the asters that can be the cushion type or the taller type, our native grasses such as the beautiful prairie drop seed, little blue stem, the big fireworks goldenrods, or Amsonias, the textures, the forms, and the colors in blends work really well together. The prairie landscape is obviously filled with a lot of grasses and a lot of perennials. In urban spaces, oftentimes we also need some shade. So again, whether it is choosing native perennials and grasses and trees and shrubs, or those adapted things that really blend well together, is personal choice. We always start with what will grow where before we put a name on that plant. I want to talk for a second here about a couple of the shrubs and trees that really make this pop in the fall landscape. Many people have a hardscape, whether it's benches, retaining walls, a patio, a boulder fountain area, and plant material can help soften that, bring that back to, again, making a transition from a more managed landscape into one that is a little bit more naturalized. So we're looking at beautyberry with all of those incredible amethyst colored fruits weeping over the edge of this concrete bench area. Next to it is a Siberian iris, sword-like foliage with earlier season flowering. You may want to choose a tree that is native rather than the ginkgo, but the gold fall color is really going to be spectacular. Remember also that choosing the woody plant material, the trees and shrubs, gives you the bones of the landscape, whether it's a small urban area or a much larger space. And then we add to that those masses and drifts and sweeps of all of the beautiful seasonal color. Thinking in terms both of what you want in terms of color combinations and texture and form, as well as the season in which you want them to be beautiful. Most residential landscapes don't really have room for a naturalized prairie unless they're on an acreage. However, you can put bits and pieces together and make it really quite effective. Behind me is Indian grass, essentially naturally seeded, but a transitional zone right here includes one of our wonderful native grasses, which is side oats grama. Behind it is one of the vertical cultivars of switchgrass, which is northwind switchgrass, again in big masses and sweeps. Another cultivar of switchgrass is Cheyenne Sky, which is lower, shorter, a brilliant red, backed up in some landscapes, or fronted in this case, with catmint, which has a beautiful blue texture and color and form to it, attracts a lot of pollinators. You can also still use a lot of those great woody shrubs. There is a dogwood, which is a selection of our native gray dogwood called muskingum, much shorter, going into a brilliant Merlot wine fall color. So again, the combination of plant material that has some movement to it, some texture, some form, brilliant fall color, the capability of attracting attention, whether it's people that are going to strip the seeds off the side oats grama, or watch those grasses move and sway in the winter, or even attract wildlife. Finches, for example, are going to be eating all the seeds of those cosmos, which are seeded as an annual to be able to give sort of a structure to the prairie landscape beneath it. Keep in mind that most of what we've seen are native or adapted plants that have flourished here in Nebraska for years and years. Once you get them established, you'll have beautiful ornamentals that are used to the elements here in the region. Last time we showed you what to look for when selecting your ornamental bulbs. Picking healthy fresh bulbs is essential to the plant's overall vigor as well as to their flowering. For our next feature, we're going to demonstrate how to plant your bulbs for the best chance at success. There are a few bulbs that we plant early in the fall of the season because they need to be fresh. However, the majority of those we wait until a little bit later for a couple of reasons. First off, what we want to have happen is we want the soil to still be warm enough to allow the roots to establish, but we don't want it warm enough that the shoots push up out of the ground. So oftentimes we wait until late October, early November, even as late as December if the ground isn't frozen. Another thing that is really important is to take a look at the site where you want those bulbs to put on their beautiful spring show and then prepare it appropriately. There are a couple of ways to plant bulbs. One of them is to dig up an entire bed, dig it to the correct depth, make sure you have good compost. If you want to add some of the amendments that are helpful in good bulb health, you can add some things like bone meal, mix that in very well, and make sure that you are at the right planting depth for those bulbs. The second way is to actually dibble the bulbs using a bulb dibbler. You can use something like a drill bit that attaches to a regular old drill and then drill that hole again to the right depth. One of the cautions about that, however, is that if you're in a heavy clay soil, the bulbs may rot to begin with, but if you are using that drill and sort of scouring those sides or glazing those sides, that might make those conditions not exactly right for the bulb. A third method is to scatter, cover over the surface as long, again, as you have a good prep beneath that. So you have three different methods of getting the soil ready to get the bulbs in the ground. Then what you want to look at is how deep should they be planted. It does make a difference because if they're too shallow, again, they're going to push that shoot too early in the season. They may freeze off, they may come up too early in the spring and freeze off in the spring. Animals can get them a lot easier, and that can be an issue anyway, especially in locations where you either have squirrels that are digging for acorns or you have voles or mice. In those cases, you may actually need to protect those bulbs with hardware cloth. And that can be kind of a complicated process, or at least a time-consuming process, may be well worth it so you don't sacrifice that early spring flowering. Another thing you want to think about with depth is actually the size of the bulb itself. Too deep with those little guys and they're going to exhaust all their energy pushing up to the surface. And the same thing is true really with the great big ones. You want to make sure that they have enough depth to be able to root well, stay in the ground, and push up. Now, another thing that people oftentimes ask is there a way to know which side is up? Most bulbs have a little bit of root on the underside, so you can see kind of the little dried up roots, and typically the pointed side of the bulb is supposed to be up. People think oftentimes that if the bulbs are planted upside down, they will actually right themselves in the soil because they will see the shoots of those bulbs come up anyway. That doesn't happen. What happens is the bulbs still stay upside down, the shoot emerges, and then it has to actually transverse the entire circumference of the bulb before it can break the surface. Again, that is a waste of energy. You want to make sure after you get the bulbs in the ground, you gently get the surface smoothed, and then you want to mark those bulbs, especially if they're in a location where in the spring you may dig into them. One of the best ways to do this that is unobtrusive in the landscape, stick golf tees in the ground. Or if you're really thinking ahead, you can plant something like grape hyacinths, which go dormant in the summer, and then they put their foliage up in the fall and the winter. Those mixed in with regular bulbs like daffodils and tulips will tell you where those bulbs are later. Planting your bulbs the correct way at the correct time will give you a better chance at success in the years to come. Again, it's a really good idea to mark the area where you've planted the bulbs so you'll know what's planted and where in your beds to reduce the risk of forgetting and digging them up later. Nebraska has a variety of weather conditions that can wreak havoc on your landscape. This is especially true in the winter when harsh conditions can decimate the trees, shrubs, and ornamentals even if they're dormant. For this week's landscape lesson, we're going to show you some symptoms of winter damage and help you with some tips on what to do about it. Our really erratic winter weather can cause a lot of damage to some of our plants if we're not paying very much attention in the garden. We want to bring your attention to a couple of things that can happen with some of our garden plants in the backyard farmer garden, and that starts with plants that heave themselves out of the ground. So in the dry conditions, warm, sunny conditions, not much frost or abrupt changes in temperature, things like the heucheras or the coral bells can come right out of the ground, and then if you don't take steps to alleviate that, come next spring you're not going to have any heucheras or any coral bells. Another one that does that is the big root cranesbill, which has kind of a very fleshy root with not very many fibrous root hairs, not much to attach. So there's kind of a dilemma in what to do. Do you smash those back down in? Do you mulch? The ideal thing to do is to wait until the ground freezes hard and then put some mulch around the crown of that plant. Unfortunately, in the conditions that we sometimes have, we end up with freeze thaw and no frost in the ground, and that is when they can push themselves up. Best thing to do in that instance is go ahead, take a look, pile some soil back around the crown, try to re-engage those roots, and again, even though we don't have any frost, go ahead and mulch around the crown. Another great dilemma this time of year is things are starting to look a little bit ratty and tatty. If you left some of that beautiful winter interest plant stuff standing over the winter, it might be flopped all over the ground. That becomes great habitat for things like the voles, which is not a good thing. And then do you cut it all the way back to the ground, or how far back exactly? Again, some of that material can actually protect the crowns of the plants and keep them from either drying out, desiccating, or heaving, or just plain old winter kill if they're on the edge of the hardiness. One of those is the hardy mums. We want to cut back some of that material to clean it up a little bit, but remember that the rest of it will actually trap moisture. So take a look at your garden when you can, when there isn't any snow cover. Keep in mind that the dry winter conditions and the desiccation can cause that kind of damage to the root system. Do what you can then to alleviate that before spring comes. So take a look at plants that may have heaved themselves out of the ground, push them back into contact with the soil, a little bit of mulch, a little bit of water potentially, and take a look also at cutting back some of that foliage that has died and really crushed itself. That will help those plants get through the winter months. Last time we gave you some options when it comes to choosing containers. The pot itself can be simple and functional, but it can also add a design function to your home landscape. Right now we're going to focus on some good selections for ornamentals to grow in those containers. Once again, we're going to head out to Union Square here in Lincoln to show you some gorgeous combinations in public containers. The popularity of containers in the landscape really continues to rise. People treat them a little differently though. So there are some people who love to change them out, starting with early things in the spring, changing for summer, changing for fall and winter, and then starting over again the next year. However, if you have enough space, you want to be a little bit creative with it and give some things a try, what you can do is plant once early in the spring with a combination of perennials and annuals. Cross your fingers, hope those perennials live through to the next winter, but in the meantime, really watch how things take off. This is one of the planters that has that kind of a combination. We have kind of the classic spiller, thriller, and the fillers in here. Some things got really happy, others have really gone off season. And again, in the fall of the year, to be able to use some of the perennials as opposed to simply annuals does give you an edge over both frost, so that you don't lose all your annuals, and potentially a different kind of a character. If you look at what we have in this planter, which has really been beautiful during the entire season, you can see we have bits and pieces of the goldenrod that's already finished. This is a perennial. We have the fine texture and sort of the vertical structure of one of our southern woods, which is actually an artemisia. Again, that is a perennial and one that will really take tough conditions. These are balanced out by a nice color combination of some of our more popular annuals, starting with this spiller, which is of course one of the sweet potatoes. The ornamental sweet potatoes, when they're really happy, are not only going to spill, they're going to crawl and creep and really anchor a container to the ground. We also have one of the annual fountain grasses, gives that great color, but again, this is not a grass that will take us into the winter months in the planter, short of being simply the fine structure that's remaining. The kales are a great addition to a planter because they are cool season plants and they are not going to succumb to those early freezes in the fall. A more subtle and really airy combination includes one of our native grasses in this lower planter. This is prairie drop seed, which is very fine textured, smells like vanilla when it's in flower. Whether it's actually going to make it through the winter or not really remains to be seen, and that is one of the gambles with perennials in planters. However, we also have catmint, tough as a box of rocks, beautiful flowering, great for the pollinators, really set off in this instance by one of the annual salvias. And you may notice that we have had just enough freeze or frost damage that this is really going a little bit off color. So again, to use that combination of perennials and annuals in a planter will extend the season without needing to do the kind of thing that a lot of people do, which is replace everything and start over again. A final combination that really goes into the rich burgundies and the beautiful fiery colors of fall also includes mostly annuals and some perennials. This is again one of those pennisetums that is brilliant in fall color but will not make it through the winter, with the exception of a little bit of structure. We have a different one of the ornamental cabbages or kales, and this one is a deep purpley sort of color with a lot of fringe to it. Our old friend the sweet potato, but we also have a little bit of the catmint kind of buried under the grasses, and we have one of the fall blooming asters. Some of the shorter asters in sort of a cushion-like form will be one of the things that gives you a brilliant pop of color that might be unexpected in a planter, sets off the texture of the grasses, and lets you really extend the season in your container gardening. These tips are the basics for creating natural beauty in your containers. They're great concepts to start with as you use your imagination by trying new plants as they come on the market, or combining them with your own personal likes and ornamentals you've had success with in the past. The possibilities really are endless. Let's take a few minutes now to answer your emails. We welcome those questions, comments, and pictures. Just send us an email to byf@unl.edu and we'll try to answer a few of them on our show each week. Let's get started with a question from the Omaha area. This is pretty timely because this particular viewer sent in a picture of a vole. Dennis Ferraro talks about these and the real damage they can do in the landscape in the winter months. This little guy was coming out from under snow cover, so you can see the snow tunnel, going to the bird feeder, going back under, and the owner actually traced that vole trail back through the perennials, so is really expecting a lot of damage this particular season from these creatures. We have a lot of good information on the Backyard Farmer website about how to manage or trap voles or get rid of them, and as Dennis will tell you, it's pretty easy to trap them using either a snap trap, placed perpendicular to the run, or using a box trap and catching a whole bunch of the guys. And you really do need to consider that because they can do an awful lot of damage in the landscape. We have a question also about a beautiful prairie plant, and this is timely as well because this viewer says they saw this in an urban landscape in a downtown location in central Nebraska. This is a plant called Dahlia purpurea, purple prairie clover, and if I had to guess, I'd say this is probably the one that is the selection called Stephanie, which our very own Dale Lindgren developed, named after First Lady Stephanie Johans. Beautiful, drought tolerant, in the bean family, so capable of withstanding pretty tough soil conditions, doesn't need much water. And since the one that he selected is a long bloomer, you have a great season of beautiful color as well as great texture and foliage. We have people that have called in from a number of locations, especially in eastern Nebraska, although I suspect that we have some western viewers with our temperatures up in the 70s this week who will have the same question. And that is that they have small bulbs, typically the minor bulbs, coming out of the ground already. That might include the snowdrops, scillas, glory of the snow, maybe even some crocus coming up. The question being, of course, what can be done about it, especially with the prediction for hopefully a little bit of moisture and snow cover, but unfortunately also a drastic drop in temperature again. The best thing to do is make sure that they are not completely exposed to the elements, especially wind, the drying, desiccating wind. Perhaps do a little bit of remulching or cover them back up just lightly with a loose mulch. Don't pack it down because those bulbs again have begun to emerge. Hope for the best. These are pretty tough bulbs. We actually have bloom dates on some of them that start as early as the first week in February. We have a question from a North Platte viewer about a cottonwood. This particular cottonwood is a pretty big one and has the fruiting bodies of a fungus all up and down the trunk. The unfortunate thing about this is what you see on the outside suggests we have trouble going on the inside. Looks like a big tree to begin with. There's also a branch off to one side that appears to have a pretty poor attachment to the main trunk, and chances are there's a lot of rot going on in the interior of the tree. Not much you can do about it other than if it is a tree in a hazard location where it has the potential to fall on a home, a car, a child. Have a certified arborist look at that tree and see whether it is time to take it down and consider starting over. That's never something our viewers want to hear, but we certainly would hate to have a tree fall on somebody because it did have that rot in the center of the plant. We have a viewer who sent in pictures of a shrub that she saw bloom with fruit on it last fall. This is from the Grand Island area. Gorgeous plant. She's wondering if this is beautyberry, and because the ones she's seen have a little different fruiting structure on them. She's exactly right. This is beautyberry. There are several different species that are actually available and thrive in the Plains states, at least in the central to eastern part of the state. One of them is Japanese beautyberry. The other one is a species that is Calicarpa dichotoma, and then we have some selections beyond that. They fruit in the fall of the year with these incredible amethyst-colored fruits. They usually appear maybe September, October. They don't really persist very long, but they are very striking when you see them. Depending on the species, the variety, and the location, you may need to cut them back to within 6 inches of the ground. They flower and fruit on new wood, so you're not cutting off the flowering and the fruiting for the next season. And certainly enjoy that beautiful fruit. It's a color we don't see very often in nature. Ornamental grasses are a wonderful addition to any home landscape. After they're established, they'll give you years of satisfaction with their tall stalks and beautiful seed heads. You'll also have the added benefit of listening to them rustle in the wind, and a lot of them have great winter interest as well. Let's take a few minutes to check out a few of these selections that would make a great addition to your front yard. Ornamental grasses continue to be a really popular choice for many of our landscapes. They can be combined with one another, with other grasses, with perennials, with shrubs, trees, and they can form beautiful backdrops or foregrounds for anything else going on in the landscape. They are screening materials, they give great seasonal interest, they also provide movement, form, color, and texture. One of the really popular ones is the maiden grasses, for good reason. They have great, beautiful plumes with something called a digitate seed head, which refers to the palm of your hand, or fingers, if you will. They come in a multiplicity of forms, most of them upright and vase-shaped, fine texture to very bold texture. Some of them have stripes in the foliage, like this one, which is called super stripe. Others have a variegation along the margin. One of the most elegant of those is one called Morning Light Maiden Grass that actually looks like curling ribbon. Very elegant, very late to flower and low down in the crown of the plant with kind of a pinkish plume. In fact, sometimes it doesn't even bloom depending on the season. A couple of cautionary notes about the maiden grasses. First off, they're not native. Second, there are concerns a bit about some of them spreading and becoming pretty invasive in southern states and potentially here as well, because they are capable of running with rhizomes as well as producing seed. The feather reed grasses are another popular non-native ornamental grass for the landscape. They have an upright form. They bloom quite early, typically in June, and then you get the very narrow tan plume that actually can remain on the plant during the entire winter months. They're certainly smaller than pretty much every maiden grass, which means that they have a place in a landscape where you really can't get away with all that big fluff above your head or against a fence. Most of them are sterile, and that would be Carl Forster feather reed grass. The hybrids are, this is one called Avalanche that has a little bit of a variegation in the foliage. Again, they're very dense, and since they're sterile, you don't have to worry about them spreading. There's another feather reed grass, on the other hand, that does spread. It's called fall blooming or Korean feather grass. It has a vase-shaped form, and like you would expect out of the common name, it blooms in the fall. Again, a beautiful grass, but it is one that you have to watch because it will produce a lot of seedlings. As we start talking about native grasses as ornamentals in the landscape, let's start with north wind switchgrass, which is an upright vertical form of our native switchgrass. Beautiful fall color, great form, obviously a little bit tall, and the switchgrasses will produce seed. One of the reasons you absolutely have to be careful about which variety you select of really any of the ornamental grasses, though, is what you want it to do. Because this one turns gold and stands upright, we have a number of other switchgrasses that are much smaller, have red in the foliage, red in the flower, red in the seed head, such as one called Cheyenne Sky. Still others are pretty quiet in the landscape. They just have these tiny little bead-like seeds. They're a little bit shorter. They add a beautiful sway and movement to the landscape, but not much in terms of color. Our native big and little blue stems provide other options for use in the ornamental landscape. They have a more open, natural character. Obviously, big blue stem, or turkey foot as some people call it, is pretty large, much more subtle than the larger plumes of some of the maiden grasses or even the switchgrasses. Little blue stem, on the other hand, is shorter, great graceful plumes of silver. Oftentimes you can select ones that have a lot of blue in the foliage, turn rust or beautiful fall autumn colors as well. So that gives you an option for something that is just tough as anything in the landscape, lets you stay with the native palette and still get the movement and the texture and the color and the form of the grasses in the landscape. Movement, color, texture, and form are all features of these wonderful ornamental grasses. They can be in the foreground or make a great backdrop to all kinds of perennials that would be perfect for your home. And as we've just seen, there are plenty of great choices for you. Thank you so much for joining us again for Lifestyle Gardening. Next time we'll be focusing on a water-conserving landscape feature that we call a rain chain. We'll also take a look at color combinations for your pots and container plants. We hope you'll join us again, so good morning, good gardening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time on Lifestyle Gardening.